In the previous chapter, you learned a lot about drawing simple forms in the 3D space. Now we're going to learn something about actual animals. I'll show you the basic plan of the body of various species and how to memorize the proportions. The bodies of animals are often very complex. They're made of many parts, and there are all these special proportions between them. To draw animals realistically from imagination, you need to know what these body parts are and how they're connected. Notice that the biggest part of the body and the legs fit inside a rectangle. This rectangle shows you the proportion of the height of the animal to the length of its body. If you want to memorize it, it's best to compare it to a square. For example, the body of a horse is only a little bit longer than a square. In the lion and the dog, this rectangle is about 30% longer than the square. And in the rhino, it's 50% longer. You don't have to remember the actual numbers, it's all estimated anyway, so you can just see this rectangle as either a squarish rectangle, a long rectangle, or a very long rectangle. Next, we need to find the proportion between the height of the torso and the distance between the torso and the ground. So you can draw a horizontal line in the middle of this rectangle and then see where the torso is in relation to it. In the case of the dog and the lion, the torso is slightly taller than the half of the rectangle. In the case of the horse, it's slightly shorter. In the case of the rhino, it's much taller. It's actually pretty close to taking 3/4 of the rectangle. Keep in mind that this proportion may vary even within a single species. For example, the torso of a young lioness may be exactly as long as the distance to the ground, and a slim hunting dog may have proportions more similar to the horse. So memorize it like this. Does the animal have long legs? Make the torso shorter than the distance. Does it look robust? Make the torso taller. Now we also need the length of the torso. This is quite easy to remember, because the herbivores need huge chests to digest all that plant matter. In our horse and rhino, the torso takes up so much space that the space that is left looks like a tall rectangle. In the carnivores, this space will look more like a square. It's still a rectangle, but it's not as tall. So once you have all these rectangles, you can draw an oval inside these rectangles, and it will have correct proportions. But keep in mind it's actually an ellipsoid. It has a volume and sides. So now you can see why we spend so much time learning how to draw all these 3D shapes. You may also use these rectangles to find the proper curve of the spine and the hips. Just compare it to the upper edge of the rectangle. So in the case of the dog and the lion, the curve goes slightly up, but it's mostly straight until it curves towards the back. In the case of the horse, the curve goes visibly up and it also curves strongly. And in the case of the rhino, the spine is almost straight, but it slopes dramatically in the back. The hips look like a curve in the side view, but it's actually a curved plane that looks like this. In the top view, the hips plane will be narrower than the torso. To draw the shoulder area, we need to draw the clavicle area first, or just the area where the clavicles would be if the animal had them. This would be easy. Just cut the torso in half horizontally. In the 3D view, it will look like this. To find the top of the shoulder blade, cut the torso in thirds vertically, then draw the shoulder blade over the rectangle and slightly behind the first section. Then you can connect these parts to create the upper part of the shoulder. This part will actually look like a horse collar in the 3D view, and it will create the form of the front of the body. To draw the lower part, go down and to the right, and then curve under the body. In this default pose, this lower curve shouldn't go further than the shoulder blade. In the 3D view, keep these curves aligned. To draw the limbs, we need to know where the joints are. The shoulder joint will be here, next to the clavicle area, and these 2 points will move together. The elbow will be at the bottom of the shoulder area. For long-legged dogs, it can be slightly lower. The location of the wrist will depend on the species as well. If you draw a horizontal middle line in the area between the torso and the ground, you'll notice the position of the wrist relative to this line. You can memorize this relation as under the line, over the line, crossing the line, and so on. If you connect these joints now, you'll get the arm, the forearm, and the hand. The hand should be straight at first and then curved close to the ground, unless we're talking about the horse. In this case, the hand turns into fingers around the middle line between the wrist and the ground. If you're bothered by me calling this part a hand, you can think of it as a foot or a paw. I just want you to be able to compare these parts of the body to your own. Also, here's the location of the shoulder blade. You don't have to draw it, but knowing that it is here will help you rotate the shoulder. Let's add the hind legs now. The hip joint will be located under our hip area and to the side of it rather than directly under it. In the top view, it would look like this. Generally, the larger the animal, the lower the joint will be. In the default pose, the knee usually faces the elbow. It's a complex joint that doesn't bend in one spot, so we're going to draw it like an area. The location of the ankle should be determined in relation to the wrist. In most species, it will be slightly above it. However, the plantigrade animals will be an exception to this rule. They keep their whole hands and feet flat on the ground, so the wrists and ankles will be on the same level. Now if you connect these joints, you'll see the thigh bone, the shin bone, and the foot. You can also add the bottom of the hooves for the hoofed animals to better see if the pose is stable. When drawing the limbs in the 3D view, make sure that the joints are aligned, that they are placed on the same lines relative to the axis in your view. If they're rotated in relation to this axis, this rotation must be planned as well. Let's draw the head now. As I mentioned before, a head can be created out of two spheres. We'll talk more about the shape of the head later. For now, we're only interested in the size of the head in relation to the body. To find this proportion, compare the length of the whole head to the length of the shoulder blade. Memorize it as being slightly longer than it, slightly shorter than it, or maybe as equal to it. For the neck to look proportionate, you need to place the head a correct distance from the front of the body. It will be the distance between the back of the head and the place where the spine ends in front of the body. This distance can be memorized the same way we did with the length of the head. Just compare it to the length of the shoulder blade. These 2 points are our new joints. This one will rotate the head, and this one will rotate the neck. Finally, let's add the tail. The only tricky thing about it is that it starts roughly over the hip joint, even though in the side view it looks as if it started much lower than that. Let me quickly present how to use all this information in practice. Let's say I want to draw a lion. I know that a lion has to have this long rectangular frame, so I draw this rectangle first. You don't have to draw it if you can imagine it well enough. Then I cut it in half horizontally to find the bottom of the torso. Then I draw this squarish rectangle on the right to create a space for the torso on the left. Next I draw the curve of the spine and hips. Then I cut the torso in half to find the clavicle area, and then I cut it in thirds to find the location of the shoulder blade. This allows me to draw the whole shape of the shoulder area. Next, I can add the legs. I draw their curve, and then I make sure they bend in the right places. I add the neck, and then I add a placeholder for the head, making it almost as long as the shoulder blade. Then I only have to add the tail, and my simple lion pose is done. I want you to do the same as an exercise for this lesson. You can use any of these 4 mammals. Remember that it doesn't have to be pretty and clean. Focus on the proportions, not on the style. I've also prepared a reference sheet with proportions of many popular species. Feel free to use it even after the course ends. So today you learned about the proportions of the mammal body. Next time we're going to do the same with reptiles and birds.